July 1944, Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. A British economist named John Maynard Keynes arrives at the Mount Washington Hotel carrying what he believes is the most important document of the post-war world. He has spent 3 years designing it. It is a proposal for a neutral global reserve currency that no single nation controls, a currency he calls the Bancor. Issued by an international institution accountable to all member states equally, backed by a basket of commodities, and designed so that no country can accumulate the kind of surplus that forces other countries into permanent deficit. Keynes understands something that almost nobody in that room understands as clearly as he does. Whoever controls the reserve currency controls the world's financial system, and whoever controls the world's financial system controls the terms on which every other nation trades, borrows, and survives a crisis. He knows this because Britain did it for a century. And he can see, with painful clarity, that Britain is about to stop doing it. The American delegation, led by Harry Dexter White, listens politely to Keynes's Bancor proposal. Then they present their own. The dollar, convertible to gold at $35 per ounce, as the center of the new global financial architecture. Every other currency pegged to the dollar. The International Monetary Fund, capitalized primarily by the United States. The World Bank, headquartered in Washington. Every structural decision placing American institutions at the hub of the post-war global economy. Keynes argues, he is, by general consensus, the most brilliant economist in the room. He loses anyway, not because his argument is wrong, because America has 70% of the world's gold reserves, the largest manufacturing base in human history, and every other nation at the table is either devastated, bankrupt, or dependent on American aid to rebuild. The argument was settled before it started. The dollar became the world's reserve currency, not because it was the most elegant solution. It became the world's reserve currency because America had spent 30 years quietly, systematically, and deliberately positioning itself to make it inevitable. And right now, in 2025, China is 30 years into running the identical strategy. The mechanism is the same. The timeline is the same. The destination is the same. And almost nobody in the Western press is explaining how deliberate and how advanced this actually is. Stay with me. To understand what China is doing, you have to understand what America actually did. Not the mythology of Bretton Woods, not the story about the dollar winning on merit, but the specific operational steps that America executed between 1914 and 1944 to make the outcome in that hotel room structurally predetermined. Because China is not improvising a geopolitical rivalry. It is reading the same playbook, step by step, and executing it with the kind of patience that a civilization measured in dynasties rather than election cycles, is uniquely positioned to sustain. In 1900, the pound sterling was the world's reserve currency. London was the center of global finance. If you were a merchant in Buenos Aires trading with a merchant in Bombay, you settled your transaction in sterling through a London bank using financial infrastructure that Britain had spent 2 centuries building. Britain's financial dominance was so total that transactions between countries that had nothing to do with Britain still ran through British institutions. This gave Britain what economists call seigniorage privilege, the ability to issue the currency everyone needs, which means you can effectively tax global commerce simply by being the entity whose money the world uses. And it gave Britain something more important than money. It gave Britain leverage. Countries that needed access to sterling credit, sterling correspondent banking, and sterling-denominated commodity markets could not easily oppose British foreign policy without risking their access to the global financial system. That leverage was not theoretical. It was the operational reality of how British imperial power actually functioned in the 19th and early 20th centuries. America understood this mechanism precisely, and from the moment the Federal Reserve was created in 1913, American policymakers began executing a deliberate strategy to transfer that mechanism from London to New York. Step 1 was becoming a creditor. When the First World War began in 1914, America lent to Britain and France. Enormous sums, structured as bonds, marketed to American investors, channeled to governments that needed dollars to buy American supplies. By the time the war ended, Britain and France owed America billions. The relationship between debtor and creditor is not symmetric. Creditors set terms. Creditors have leverage. The nations that had spent a century as the world's financial center now owed money to the nation they had previously considered a financial backwater. Step 2 was accumulating gold. Through the 1920s and 1930s, the United States systematically accumulated gold reserves. This was not accidental. Gold was the foundation of monetary credibility under the gold standard system. Whoever had the gold had the basis for making credible promises about currency value. By 1944, the United States held 70% of the world's monetary gold. This was not a natural outcome. It was the result of deliberate policy choices made over 2 decades. Step 3 was building alternative financial infrastructure. American banks expanded internationally through the 1920s, Wall Street developed as a rival to London for underwriting international bonds. American institutions gave global traders, businesses, and governments an alternative to British financial infrastructure for the first time. The alternative was initially smaller and less sophisticated than the British original, but it existed, and its existence meant that when the moment came, there was something to switch to. Step 4 was waiting. Britain exhausted itself in the Second World War. By 1944, Britain was financially dependent on American Lend-Lease support to continue fighting. The leverage had completely reversed. The country that had spent a century as the world's financial center now could not fund its own military without American credit. That reversal did not happen at Bretton Woods. It had been building for 30 years. Bretton Woods was not the cause of the transition. It was the formal ceremony acknowledging a transition that the preceding 3 decades of deliberate American strategy had already made structurally inevitable. Now, here is China, and I want to be precise about the timeline and the mechanism, because this is not a prediction about something that might happen. It is an account of something that is happening, has been happening for 25 years, and is further advanced than most Western observers are prepared to acknowledge. China's Belt and Road Initiative, launched formally in 2013 but rooted in lending patterns that began in the early 2000s, is the most direct replication of America's Step 1. China has extended over $1 trillion in infrastructure loans to more than 150 countries. Roads, railways, ports, power plants, telecommunications networks. The loans are real. The infrastructure is real. And the dependency relationships they create are real in exactly the same way that Britain's WWI debt to America was real. Countries that owe China significant sums cannot easily oppose Chinese foreign policy without risking their access to Chinese credit, Chinese markets, and the infrastructure that Chinese loans built. Pakistan, Ethiopia, Sri Lanka, Zambia, Angola. These are not random recipients of Chinese generosity. They are the early nodes of a creditor network that is designed to function the way American creditor relationships with post-WWI Europe functioned. China also holds approximately $800 billion in U.S. Treasury bonds. This is frequently discussed in Western financial media as a Chinese vulnerability. What if China dumps its Treasury holdings and destabilizes the dollar market? This framing misunderstands the dynamic. China holding American debt is not primarily a weapon China might use. It is a relationship that makes China a creditor of the United States itself. America owes China money. That relationship has the same structural logic as Britain's post-WWI debt to America. Creditors have leverage over debtors. The direction of that leverage in the U.S.-China financial relationship points toward Beijing. Step 2 of the playbook is gold accumulation. Since 2009, China has been buying gold at an accelerating pace that has no obvious innocent explanation except the one that the 1920s American precedent suggests. The People's Bank of China reports official gold reserves of over 2,000 tons. Independent analysts who track Chinese gold flows through trade data, import statistics, and state enterprise purchases estimate the actual figure could be anywhere between 4,000 and 10,000 tons. The range of estimates is wide because China does not report its gold accumulation with the transparency that the official figures imply. What is not disputed is the direction. China has been accumulating gold consistently, aggressively, and at scale for 15 years. The 2022 sanctioning of Russia's dollar reserves, the freezing of $300 billion held by Russia's central bank, was the clearest possible demonstration of why this matters. Dollar reserves can be sanctioned. Gold cannot. Every central bank in the world that watched the Russian sanctions drew the same conclusion that American policymakers drew in the 1920s when they watched Britain's financial fragility. The asset that cannot be frozen, sanctioned, or devalued by another country's monetary policy is the asset that provides genuine security. China accelerated its gold accumulation after 2022. So did India, Turkey, Poland, and a range of emerging market central banks that simultaneously reduced their dollar reserve holdings. The 1920s precedent is precise. America accumulated the gold. Then, it used the gold as the foundation for the credibility claim that made Bretton Woods possible. China is accumulating the gold. The credibility claim comes later. Step 3 is building alternative financial infrastructure. And this is where China's strategy becomes most visible to anyone paying attention and most systematically underestimated in Western analysis. CIPS, the cross-border interbank payment system, is China's functional alternative to SWIFT, the Belgium-based messaging network that coordinates the vast majority of international bank transfers. When America sanctioned Russia in 2022 and removed Russian banks from SWIFT, it demonstrated something that every country in the world with reason to worry about American foreign policy understood immediately. Controlling financial messaging infrastructure is equivalent to controlling the ability to conduct international trade. China began building CIPS in 2015. Today, over 1,000 financial institutions across more than 100 countries are connected to it. It is not yet a full replacement for SWIFT. It does not need to be a full replacement today. It needs to be a functioning alternative that grows every year. That is what it is. Simultaneously, China has been systematically negotiating yuan-denominated trade agreements with major partners. Saudi Arabia, the world's largest oil exporter, began accepting yuan for oil sales to China in 2023. The significance of this is difficult to overstate. The petrodollar system, the arrangement under which global oil trade is priced in dollars, requiring every oil-importing country to hold dollars, has been the single most important structural support for dollar reserve currency status since the 1970s. It is the mechanism that ensures continued global demand for dollars regardless of American fiscal behavior. Every transaction that moves out of dollar denomination and into yuan denomination erodes that structural demand. Saudi Arabia accepting yuan is not a small development. It is a crack in the foundation. Russia now settles the majority of its trade with China in yuan and rubles. India has been negotiating rupee-denominated trade arrangements with multiple partners. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, along with the countries that joined the expanded BRICS formation in 2024, have been actively developing frameworks for trade settlement that bypass the dollar entirely. These are not random developments driven by individual national interests. They are the components of a deliberate infrastructure strategy that replicates Step 3 of the American playbook with a precision that suggests the playbook has been studied carefully. Step 4 is waiting for America to exhaust itself. And here, the parallel becomes uncomfortable to examine honestly, because the exhaustion is visible in the arithmetic in ways that should be more alarming than they currently appear to be in public discourse. America's federal debt stands at $36 trillion. It is growing at approximately $2 trillion per year. Interest payments on that debt have crossed $1 trillion annually, exceeding the defense budget for the first time in American history. The political system has demonstrated across multiple administrations and both parties that it cannot make the fiscal adjustments required to alter this trajectory. The deficit spending continues, the debt accumulates, the interest compounds. China does not need to defeat America militarily. It does not need to outcompete America in every technology sector simultaneously. It does not need to win a Cold War through ideological persuasion. It needs America to continue doing what it is currently doing, running deficits that no serious analyst believes are sustainable, accumulating debt at a rate that no serious economist believes ends well, and allowing the gap between what the dollar claims to be and what the fiscal arithmetic underneath it says it actually is to widen year by year until the gap becomes impossible to manage. Britain did not lose the reserve currency to America because America defeated it. Britain exhausted itself. America waited. That is step 4, and it is running on schedule. Now, here's the critical part that almost nobody is saying directly. Bretton Woods did not happen gradually. It happened at a specific moment of maximum British weakness, when the structural shift that had been building for 30 years crystallized into a new arrangement that could be presented as a rational response to changed circumstances rather than as what it actually was, which was the formal acknowledgement of a power transfer that had already occurred. China is not waiting for a Bretton Woods moment. China is creating the conditions for one. It is building the gold reserves, the creditor relationships, the alternative financial infrastructure, and the yuan-denominated trade networks so that when America's moment of maximum financial weakness arrives, when the debt spiral forces a genuine credibility crisis, when the world needs a new arrangement and needs it quickly, China will be positioned to propose one, just as America was positioned in 1944. Keynes's Bancor proposal lost at Bretton Woods not because it was wrong. It lost because America had spent 30 years making sure that when the moment came, its proposal was the only one that could actually work, given the distribution of gold, credit, and institutional infrastructure that America had deliberately accumulated. If China's strategy succeeds, the next Bretton Woods equivalent will not feature a neutral currency proposal as the serious option. It will feature the yuan, backed by Chinese gold reserves, Chinese creditor relationships, and Chinese financial infrastructure, as the option that actually works. The dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves has fallen from 71% in 2001 to approximately 58% today. That is a 13 percentage point decline in 25 years. The yuan's share is approximately 2%. That number is frequently cited as evidence that the dollar's dominance is not seriously threatened. It is the wrong number to watch. The right number to watch is the trajectory of marginal change. New bilateral trade agreements are increasingly structured in non-dollar currencies. New infrastructure projects in the developing world are increasingly financed in yuan. New central bank reserve decisions in emerging markets are increasingly moving away from dollar concentration and toward gold and diversified holdings. The marginal direction of change is away from the dollar. That is the signal that matters. The dollar lost 13 percentage points in 25 years through gradual erosion that seemed manageable at each step. Britain's pound lost its reserve currency status through the same process, 30 years of gradual erosion that seemed manageable until the moment at Bretton Woods when it suddenly wasn't. America has real advantages that China lacks: deep and liquid capital markets, rule of law and institutional transparency that gives investors genuine confidence, allied nations deeply integrated into dollar-based financial systems, a history of honoring financial obligations that creates credibility that cannot be replicated quickly. These advantages are real, and they matter. They will slow any transition significantly. The dollar's displacement, if it occurs, will be measured in decades, not years. But these advantages are not structural defenses against the specific mechanism China is running. They are the equivalent of the advantages Britain had in 1930, real, meaningful, and ultimately insufficient against a patient adversary executing a coherent 30-year strategy while the defending power runs the kind of fiscal deficits that make the defender's credibility claims increasingly difficult to sustain. Keynes understood in 1944 what was happening. He was the most brilliant economist in that room. He understood the mechanism. He designed an alternative. He argued for it eloquently, and he lost because the arithmetic of the preceding 30 years had already decided the outcome. The question for America in 2025 is not whether it understands what China is doing. The question is whether it has the political will to do what Britain could not do in the 1930s and 1940s, to address the fiscal vulnerabilities that China's strategy is designed to exploit, to rebuild the credibility of dollar-denominated assets, to maintain the institutional advantages that distinguish the dollar system from any plausible alternative, and to do all of this before the moment of maximum weakness that China is patiently positioning to exploit arrives. Britain had smart people who understood what was happening. John Maynard Keynes was one of them. Understanding the mechanism was not sufficient. The math had its own momentum. And in July 1944, at a hotel in New Hampshire, the math collected. This channel exists to read the mechanism before the collection date. Subscribe if you want to keep watching the playbook run. And I want your argument in the comments. Keynes proposed the Bancor at Bretton Woods, a neutral reserve currency that no single nation controlled. He lost because America had the gold, the credit, and the infrastructure. If China reaches its own Bretton Woods moment, what does the neutral alternative look like this time? Is it the SDR, a BRICS currency, a gold-backed instrument, or something that does not exist yet? Drop your argument below. The clearest one gets pinned.